Hi everybody and welcome, this is Wrangler speaking. In this video I'm going to be featuring this card, the Z3660 by sHaNsHe, a new accelerator card for the big box Amigas, the A4000 and A3000 series, adding on A60 capability to the computer. And I'm going to be asking the question whether this is the ideal all-in-one accelerator for those big box Amigas. Before we get onto this card specifically though, I think it's helpful to take a little bit of a step back in time and just have a look at the origins of this card. To do that, let's put the Z3660 to one side and instead look at this card, which is the Commodore A3640, produced, as we can see down here on the bottom right, by Schaefer, Fish and Nines of Commodore back in 1992. This was Commodore's way of accommodating and building into their expanding Amiga lineup support for the latest Motorola chip in the 68000 series, the 68040. So they produced this card to allow that to be added in, and thereby were able to sell things like the A4000 with an A40 straight on board. This card though has a number of drawbacks with it, partly because it would seem Commodore tried to create an expansion card for the A40 as cheaply as possible. And one consequence of that is, although there are loads of chips on this card to provide that support, actually there is no space for any add-on memory, nothing like an IDE interface straight onto the the CPU's RAM, nothing like that. It's a bare bones support for the 68040. The other issue with this card is it comes in a number of different versions because there were some bugs in earlier versions. This happens to be a Rev 3.1 card, but they're all also Rev 3.0s and 3.2s, 3.2 being the latest version, the most patched version. So that is the original accelerator by Commodore, but then let's wind forward a few years because the PALs that are on this card to provide the support logic have their own firmware on it. That was released by Dave Haney several years ago, and as a result of that it became possible to replicate that card with a more modern design, and this is it, produced by John Hertel, perhaps better known as Chucky. This is the remake of the A3640 and has become known as the A3660 because it also adds support for the 68060 chip. Otherwise, it's a very similar card. If we just put the two of them side by side there, you can see that they are very, very close arrangements of all the different chips. And that therefore means that the A3660, although very welcome as an extra, more modern CPU expansion for the Amiga, it doesn't contain additional RAM or IDE or anything like that. So that's the A3660. Where does the Z3660 come in? Well, let's just line those two up. In essence, what's going on here is that the various PALs up here that we can see with the silver labels have been all consolidated into one CPLD chip here, which enables a much more compact design. You can see this card's actually physically narrower than the A3660. So that in itself provides sort of more compact design, more room in the case, more airflow. But otherwise, this card is essentially the same as the A3660 as it stands. It can only support the 68060. Support for the 68040 has been dropped, but it can, at least in principle, support an A60 up to 100 megahertz in the socket here. And there's also plans to use these add-on connectors here to put on a little daughter board that would have memory, CPU memory, up to 128 megabytes of it that's local to the CPU, and that would speed up the running of programs, etc., very considerably, because it wouldn't have to go via the motherboard interface. But to be honest, if that was all the Z3660 could do, you might well be wondering why I'm doing a video about it. Actually, there is a lot more to this board than meets the eye at first sight, particularly when you add on one of these. And this is a Z-Turn card, a version 2 Z-Turn card that is effectively a little single board computer running Linux. Dual ARM cores at the center of it, and then a number of capabilities added into the board. Let's just take a brief walk around those, and we can see therefore what this card brings when you attach it on as a little daughter board on top of the Z3660 itself. First of all, there's a gigabyte of onboard RAMs, most of which is available to the Amiga itself. And the way that works is 128 megabytes of the Z-Turns RAM becomes available as CPU RAM, so local CPU RAM, which is DMA compatible. Additionally, a further 256 megabytes of RAM becomes available from the card to be used as Zorro 3 RAM. So you can't DMA into that, but it just boosts the overall RAM of the Amiga. That's if 128 megabytes isn't enough for you in the first place. So that's memory. What else have we got on this card? Well, if I walk around to the side here, we've got an HDMI connector. That is going to provide us with retargetable graphics, albeit limited to 16-bit, but personally speaking, I think that's adequate for most purposes. Also, we have AHI and MHI support via the Z-Turn. We've got an Ethernet connector, again supported with drivers. And looking on the other side of the card, right here, we've got an SD card socket and SD card in it. The card supports SD to SCSI emulation. So in effect, this little micro SD card here is going to become our drive for the computer. So I'm going to test this all out. I should say that this card, therefore, in combination with the Z3660, is going to provide similar sorts of capabilities, a similar kind of concept as the ZZ9000. I haven't used one of those personally myself, but similar kind of thing going on. I think, though, the first thing to do is to set up this card ready for use. Now, I'm delighted to say that the CPLD on the Z3660 is already programmed with the firmware on there. And when I'm talking about setup of this card, I really do need to call out the people who have made this possible. So first of all, as I say, sHaNsHe produced the card, designed it all. And so, you know, massive thanks to him, incredible work to produce this. And then the two builders of this card, Kavanoz and sparx, produced this particular card for me. So, you know, real thanks to both of you for that. Thumbs up. So what we've got to do is set the card up. The first step of that is to put the right software on the SD card here. In passing, it's been pointed out that the SD cards that come with the Z-Turn are of HC type, whereas XC ones work a lot faster. So if we're doing benchmarking of the access time for SCSI and the rate of data transfer, we just have to bear in mind I'm not at the moment using the fastest SD cards available. I think the other word of warning or caution that I would say is this is still a card that is somewhere at a sort of early beta stage, still being actively worked on by sHaNsHe. There may need to be hardware changes to the card as it matures and develops, and almost certainly changes to the firmware and other software as the card matures. So I think we just have to bear that in mind. This is still a relatively early stage development. When we come to looking at its performance and things, let's just bear that in mind. But I think that's enough talking about the cards themselves right now. what I need to do is to get on and set up the SD card here so the Z-turn can do its stuff. And of course, as soon as I finished videoing that clip, I realized there was something important that I haven't told you yet. And that is that you may well be thinking, well, it's all very well talking about using an O60 in this socket and running that at 100 megahertz, but finding 100 megahertz capable O60s, in other words, Rev 6 ones, is really difficult to do, to find genuine chips these days. And even if you can find one, it's going to cost you probably a couple of limbs in order to be able to pay for it. All of which is true, which brings me to the extra secret ability of this card, which is to emulate using the onboard ARM CPU a 68040 under emulation with JIT capability, and according to sHaNsHe, that will then run 68 series programs at 128 million instructions per second. In other words, significantly faster than any physical 68060 can achieve. And in fact, I think it's even possible to use this combination of Z-turn with the Z3660 without an actual Motorola CPU at all and run it entirely under emulation. So an even better combination potentially from these two together, simply by Z3660 as a carrier board, the Z-turn, that's all you need. You get software compatibility under emulation, plus all the goodies I mentioned before about RTG, HDMI output, Ethernet, etc., etc. I think that really does make this combination even more compelling. But it really is now time for me to sort out the SD card and make sure I've got all the files on there that I need to. Now I'm working on a Windows machine here to set up the SD card, and I think the easiest way to approach this is to use Windows' own built-in system for modifying hard drive partitions. So that's called disk management, which you can find built in to the Windows system. Go to the start menu and search for it in there. What this shows me is two panels in essence. The top part here is just listing off all the different drives that I've got and so the usable partitions. But I think the more useful thing for these purposes is the bottom section here, where I've got each physical disk and how it's broken down into different partitions, some of which are system ones that I ought not to mess around with, and other ones are sort of user partitions. But what I've got to do is find my SD card in this list at the bottom here. And for me, this is disk 4. For you, it could well be something else. For me, disk 4 is showing me it's a removable disk, which of course is true for an SD card. And it's 28, almost 29 gigabytes of free space on it, which again sounds right to me. So this is the one. And what I need to do on this SD card is set up two partitions. The first one has to be FAT32 and the second one exFAT as a file system. And you can see the SD card already has here a FAT32 partition called boot with a drive letter of J attaching to it, and that will do for me. That's absolutely fine. So I don't need to mess with this first partition, but if I needed to, I need to do a format of that first and creation of that partition followed by the second one. I'm already halfway there. What I am going to do though is create in this unallocated space my new second partition. So what I do with that is just simply do a right click and select new simple volume, and that's going to take me into a little wizard to give the parameters to set that up. So first section is about the size, and it's basically going to default to using all of that unallocated space. That's absolutely fine for me. Assign a drive letter, which is already decided is drive I. Fine, let's just accept that. And now it's asking me about the file system to set up. It's defaulted to FAT32 here, but what other options have we got? Well, I have only got FAT32 and NTFS, and you might recall I just said that we need to set this up as exFAT. So to begin with, let's set this up as FAT32, and then we'll flip it over to become exFAT in a moment. I'm going to leave these other parameters unchanged because We're just going to change this to exFAT in a minute, and a quick format's absolutely fine. Just set up the basic disk structures. So next and finish, and a few seconds while Windows thinks about it, and there's my new volume using all the available space. So that works nicely in order to just create any old partition. Now I need to change it over to become an exFAT partition, and the way I found to do that is to use the command prompt within Windows 10. I've opened this as an elevated command prompt, so I've got administrator privileges here. Basically, if you go into the search bar in Windows, type CMD, but don't hit return, just right click on the entry that you'll get in the menu that pops up and select administrator, run as administrator. Then you get an elevated command prompt like this, which will allow you to format drives. Now, I need to use the format command on my new partition, which is partition I. So I use the drive letter I, and now I need to tell it to use the file system exFAT using /fs:/exFAT, and also I want to make this a quick format so it doesn't go ahead and format every last sector on the SD card, which will take a very long time. All I want to do is set up the basic file structures. So that's the command that I need to use. So hit return. It's asking me to insert a new disk in drive I. Well, it's already in there, so I could just carry on. It's telling me that the file system is already FAT32, which we know. That's good confirmation though. I'm changing it to exFAT, and it's 28 gigabytes in size, which again corresponds to what we were looking at in disk management a moment ago. So I am actually changing the right partition here. Always good to check that kind of thing. And I need to give it a volume label, and I'm going to call it second part because it's the second partition on this drive, so I can distinguish the two of them when I'm moving files across, which I need to do in a minute. So enter on that, and away it goes, and it's created my exFAT partition. So with that all done, I now need to move files across. There's the second part, and the boot partition, which has already got some files on it. We need to get rid of those and in fact replace those with some other files. So let me move that to one side, and over here I've got the software from sHaNsHe's GitHub area webpage, and I'll include a link to the GitHub in this video so that if you want to go and check out the Z3660, you've got all the information there. So anyway, on the GitHub are these files. So first partition, I've got this boot bin file, which is going to replace this boot bin file here. So first of all, let's get rid of all of those. And now let me copy across the one I do want. And then back to my F drive, which is the second partition. And all of these files and folders need to go across. So copy all of those and just cover them briefly. We've got various folders here for different things. I'm not sure I know exactly what all of them do, but let's see if we can run through them. So data, I think, is simply to cache the file system, and basically you don't mess with it, is as I understand it. Env, in there you can set up some environment variables to configure your device in a particular way, but there is also this config file here that we're going to come back to in a minute. So I think for now I'm going to leave the env folder as it is. HDF allows us to connect various HDF files, as you might guess, into the Amiga as straight hard files. So those might be things that you prepare on your regular PC, perhaps in WinUAE, and then copy them across to the SD card, and you've got them directly available on your machine. Kicks are for kickstart files. if you are going to boot from the onboard, the ARM emulation of the 68000 series, then you need to have a kickstart file to do that, and sound. I'm not quite sure what sound is for. I think certain startup sounds are configured there. I'm not going to mess with that either. SCSI ROM is a necessary file just to get the SD to SCSI conversion going properly. But the one I really do want to talk about is this configuration file. So let's have a look in there, because we do need to get this right. And we've got various settings, as you can see in the screen here. First up is the boot mode. And as you can see up here, we've got some helpful instructions. You can either choose the onboard CPU or various types of emulation. I think for now, what I'm going to do is comment out the emulation and, at least to begin with, test the card with the onboard CPU. Then what's the CPU speed going to be? Well, 50 megahertz, I certainly think that is fine to begin with. Again, that might be something I come back to and just look and see if I can push it all the way up to 100 megahertz or something similar. Further down now, we're looking at kickstart files. As I say, that is only relevant if you are using the onboard ARM to emulate the CPU. So I'm not sure I need that, so I'm going to comment that one out, because I'm going to use the installed kickstart on the machine itself as physical chips. Load SCSI ROM on boot. Boot from SCSI HDF files on the SD. I'm not sure I want to boot from SCSI files at this stage, so I'm going to leave that as a no. And I don't have any hard files to configure down here, so we're getting through this. Auto config RAM enable. Do I want the extra 256 megabytes of RO3 RAM? I think yes, I do. And then finally down here, we've got some settings that calibrate the O60's own built-in temperature sensor. To be honest, I'm not going to set that up right now. I'll come back to that, because it does need measuring for each and every O60 chip individually. They are all a little bit different, as the instructions are getting to here, and it does take a bit of effort to measure that properly. So I'm just going to leave that for now. It does mean that we can't exactly trust any of the temperature settings quite as they are, but that'll be okay for just getting started. So let me save that back to the SD card. And otherwise, I think we're ready now to put this all together and put it in a machine and test it out for real. Now, one of the questions that seems to come up quite a lot is, does the Z3660 fit in an A3000 given the configuration of this setup, and particularly as the Z-turn board overhangs the edge of the Z3660 carrier? And the answer to that, as you can see, is yes, it does, but there is a bit of a proviso that we'll come back to. But certainly there is enough room between the card connector and the daughter board here standing vertically to get the entire card in, and in fact enough room to just about get the SD card in and out of its slot. So that is not a consideration. The other thing we've got to think about, though, is the overall height here. It's certainly possible with this card, just like the A3060, to fit the O60 CPU here with a low profile heatsinks, and that's not a problem. But the other thing to think about is this Ethernet connector, because it's standing up quite high even to the Z-turn board, let alone to the carrier card at the bottom. So what I'm going to do is put the drive tray in so you can have a look at what it's like with that fitted, and then we'll see that it does just about fit. Right, well, the drive tray is in place, and I think you can see just through this hole here, that's the top of the Ethernet connector. Looking sideways, here's a shot of what it all looks like from the side, you can see that the drive tray actually rests on the top of the Ethernet connector. So that is going to put a bit of stress on the connector between the Z3660 and the motherboard. Something to bear in mind, but it does just about fit. I think the other thing that you're going to need thinking about is if you're going to use a floppy drive in the middle tray here, the leftmost area like this, normally that would slot in there, but oftentimes there are screws that are holding the floppy onto the bracket here. That screw there is going to connect with the top of the Ethernet socket here, which is not going to be a good thing. So if I were going to carry on with this, I'd have to remove this screw from the floppy bracket, rely on the other ones, slot that in there like that, and actually that would be all okay, I think. Now, as it turns out, the firmware for the Z3660 to work with DMA isn't fully ready yet. So because the A3000 relies on DMA for SCSI transfers, that's probably not going to be a good combination right now. As the firmware gets developed, I think the Z3660 would be a good accelerator for the A3000. But because of the DMA issues, I'm going to take this card out of here and put in an A4000 instead and test it out in that. So that was the A3000 desktop. This is the A4000 desktop, and you can see the different configuration that we've got, the way this computer's designed. Instead of having the accelerator right at the front here, it's actually front to back, somewhat in the middle of the case, as a matter of fact. And that presents us with different dimensions in which to fit this card. It does mean it fits reasonably well. There's quite a lot of space here at the front where the SD card is, so I can get that in and out quite easily. And we don't have the problem of this Ethernet socket fouling with anything. So that's the basic setup. You'll see I haven't added in the CPU yet, and that's because I thought it would be fun just to try this card running straight under emulation. So I have set up the configuration file to accommodate that, and we haven't got any drives connected here. You can see no floppy, no hard drive, anything like that. So I'm just going to turn this on and show you what happens. And it's running a straight 3.2 ROM. So let's power up. So you get a rather shrill shriek. I don't know if the mic caught that, which happens apparently not all the time. Sometimes just through the hardware design. Sometimes you get that beep, sometimes you don't. It doesn't mean anything. You also got these 4 LEDs light up on the Z turn, just showing that that's active. I've got a power light down here on the Z3660 itself. Next to that, incidentally, is a little activity light, which isn't on at the moment. I'm assuming that's because that's showing when the CPU is working, but of course we don't have an actual CPU at the moment, so nothing on that. But what's the video output showing? Let me just flick over to that, and it's showing exactly what you would expect it to show on a machine that has no floppy and no hard drive. Kickstart's telling me nothing's connected, and I need to do something about that. So the emulation working, easily well enough just to get into Kickstart there. Perhaps we need to give it some sterner tests in a minute. So next steps then to reassemble this machine a little bit more. And then I think what we've got to do is just test out the capabilities of this card. How fast is it? How capable is it? Does the emulation really cope with all circumstances? And we'll do some speed checks both on the emulated 68040 and a real 68060, and just see how this card compares with other accelerators. So I need a hard disk file in order to have a workbench set up to boot from, and rather than creating that from scratch, I think what I'll do is copy an existing workbench setup from my AA3000 Plus, and I've found a quick way of doing that in WinUAE. What I need to do is click on the hard drives, CD and hard drives tab there,
connect my existing device from my other machine, and then click the Create Hard Disk Image File button and navigate to where I want to create that in the usual File Explorer. I'll do all of that, give it a file name, and what that's going to do is simply automatically create a hard disk file from my existing device. So it takes a bit of time to work its way through, but I think this is a really neat way of creating an automatic HDF file that I can use straight on the SD card with pretty much no effort. There might be one or two things in the setup of my AA3000 Plus that don't quite fit with the new machine that I'm creating here. You know, for example, if I'm using monitor files or something that don't work on that machine, I need to be a little bit careful about that. But otherwise, this is a really quick method of creating that hard disk file. I'm going to cut through all of the pause here while it actually processes all of this, and we'll just come back and see this in operation in the machine.
Okay, so the hard file is on the SD card, and I've actually now also put a real 68060 in the card, so we could check now with physical 060 and also with the emulation. I've set up the SD card's config file so that we're going to start with CPU. Let's check this card out with a native processor running in it and see how we perform. I think the next thing to do is just to turn on the power button, and away we go. The lights come on. I'm not sure if you saw there's an appreciable delay before the power goes bright while it does its stuff. But let me show you what's going on screen. Because I copied this hard file off another machine, it's set up with all of these messages while it goes through its startup sequence, just so I know what's going on. And we're into Workbench. Now, first of all, apologies here. This is super low resolution, all crammed up. We will come back to RTG later, but for now we are stuck with this non-interlaced screen simply because it looks terrible on the feed if I use the interlaced screen modes, and if I try double PAL or double NTSC, I don't get anything at all because of their weird refresh rates. So I'm afraid this is it for now, but this is enough to be getting on with and seeing what's going on. Now let's try a show config. What can we see here? So it has recognized the 060 CPU, it's Rev 6, and the associated FPU and MMU, so that's good. And then down here we're showing the memory that's been auto-configured. So I've got the about 2 megs of chip RAM. I've actually got 4 megs of motherboard fast RAM in place. So that's what that entry is. And then here is the 128 megabytes of DMA local RAM, you might call it, and that's what AmigaDOS calls it as well. So local to the CPU. And then 256 megabytes of Zorro 3 RAM. Can't DMA to that, but it's just boosting my overall RAM. And we can see that up here. Well, call that 400 megabytes of RAM. That's more than enough for pretty much anything. Let's have a look at sysspeed first of all. What we will do is just do some quick tests here for CPU, MIPS and MFLOPS. I should say at the moment I'm running in 50 megahertz. I will come back later and do the higher clock rate, see if I can push towards 100 megahertz. So there we are, 50 megahertz, 66 MIPS and 26, 27 MFLOPS. We ought to look at memory speed as well. So let's click on that and let it do its stuff. This just takes a moment, particularly when we get to the chip RAM moves. So we might do a little bit of a cut here and come back when it's completed. Okay, so we have all the memory speed tests here. Let's just go right back up to the top Not surprisingly, the cache read speed really fast. And ROM, let's skip over that. That's perhaps not that relevant. But when we get into read in longs from fast memory, 25 megabytes a second, and scroll down, writing 18 megabytes a second. So I'm going to make a note of these numbers, and we'll come back later on to compare this with other accelerator cards. The other thing we should test while we're here is the hard disk access speed. So let me just switch over to use the right drive here and get the drive speeds. There we are. So somewhere between 10 and 17-ish megabytes a second. So the access speed to the SD card really fast. That makes this machine feel really lively whenever you do anything, just because it's getting icons and the like from the drive so much quicker than we're used to. So looking pretty promising. That was sysspeed. Now let's have a look at sysinfo, see what we get out of that. And let's just run the traditional speed test. And not surprisingly, given our clock speed is 50 megahertz, we're twice as fast as a 25 megahertz A4000 normally is, even with an A40 in it. So some nice results here, kind of in line with expectations. Perhaps let's just test the drive speed just for amusement's sake. We're on SD0. Let's just test the speed. Well, that's saying, let's call that 20 megabytes a second, 20 megabytes a second, so super fast there. Fantastic. One thing I should say before we go any further here is, of course, we're running on the CPU, and you might expect the CPU, physical CPU, to be using the ROMs that are on the motherboard, but those, in fact, are diag ROM chips on the motherboard, and yet here we are running full desktop on the Kickstart. And the reason for that is, even when you're running with the CPU, really cleverly, you're able to use soft Kickstart files that are on the SD card. So it's not just emulation that benefits from that, it's actually the physical CPU as well. I just think that's super cool because it means it's so much easier to update if and when there's a new version of Kickstart, or if you want to switch to diag-ROM or something. So much easier just to update an SD card than it is to dig all the way deep down into your Amiga to change the Kickstart ROM chips. You might have seen that in one of my previous videos I addressed a similar problem where we didn't have this neat little SD card solution to rely on. So super neat feature of this card, being able to run soft Kickstart files even with a physical CPU. Right, well, that was the card running with a physical O60. Let me now switch it over into emulation, and we'll do the same thing again and see how we get on. Okay, so nothing looks physically different now. The only thing that's changed is that one line in the config sequence to switch over to UAE JIT instead of CPU. The card back in, the reader down here, and I'm going to click go again and switch you over so you can see what I can see. And we're booting, as you would expect. Right, I don't know if I'm just imagining it, but that certainly seemed more perky getting into Workbench than it did with a real O60. Again, let's just have a look at show config here. So show config notices that now we're running on the face of it with an O40, which is exactly right. The emulation is emulating a 68040, not an O60. Now, I think in practical terms, that really doesn't make any difference. I certainly know that some instructions from the 68040 were removed going to the O60, particularly from the FPU instruction set. just to fit everything onto the chip. What I'm not entirely sure is whether anything got added. In other words, are we missing out any 68060 instructions only under the emulation? Not sure about that. There might be one or two perhaps. But anyway, as far as the machine's concerned, we're running with a 68040. The other interesting thing that's changed down here is the memory allocations. This figure under CPU emulation was 128 megabytes. Interestingly, now we've got 256 megabytes under emulation, which in total is giving us, half a gigabyte of RAM. That is easily the most I've had in any Amiga, and I can't imagine I'll get anywhere close to using all that memory. But enough jabber about that. Let's have a look at the benchmarks. So again, SysSpeed recognizing there's over 500 megabytes of fast RAM here. Come on, let's get to those all-important CPU and FPU speeds. 1300, let's call it 1400 MIPS and 143 MFLOPS, super quick on those kinds of things under emulation. What about memory tests? Let's have a go with those. And again, we'll do a quick cut here while we work our way through the chip RAM tests. So we're done on this memory test. Let's just whiz back to the top again. So read fast longs, 40 megabytes per second, and the write speed even faster at 44 megabytes per second. So it's pretty speedy memory access. But let's reserve judgment on those figures until I've been through all the tests and can line them up for you against other cards. So that was that. The other one we need to check while we're here in SysSpeed is the drive speed. So let's again switch over to the right drive and have a go with that. And if memory serves, these are pretty much the same speeds that we got using the physical CPU, not surprisingly, because it's exactly the same drive that we're using. So I'll make a note of those, but for time being, let's crack on and have a go with sysinfo. What does that say in terms of CPU speed? So we're running 7 times faster than this machine originally worked at, the A40 at 25 megahertz. And even sysinfo is thinking that I'm cheating in some way and I've come up with a virtual Amiga. But as you can see, it's not a virtual Amiga at all. It's just one that's running under an emulated CPU. All right, let's come out of sysinfo. That's all the tests with the emulation for now. What I'll get on and do is test the real 060, but overclocked. Okay, so the only thing that's visibly different with the setup now is that I've added this low profile heatsink and fan to the CPU. If I'm overclocking, then I absolutely need that. As I say, this is a low profile fan. It's the same one that I use on the BFG card, so that this will fit in under the panel, the drive bay for the A4000. So I've kept my options open there. Obviously, I've got to do something about these cables sticking up, but it will fit the A3000. Otherwise, I've updated the SD card to 100 megahertz, and now's the time to hit the power button and get going. And let's switch over while we're doing this. And we're booting. Usual delay while setpatch does its stuff. And then through the other bits of startup sequence. And we're into desktop. And just briefly to check on the CPU speed, let's just call this up. And at the top here, well, 101 megahertz, we'll settle for 100 megahertz. So that's what we're running at. I did try a few other speed settings, clock speeds for the CPU, things like 64 megahertz, 75, 80. None of those were stable. So I do wonder which combinations are allowable and fully supported. Certainly 50 and 100 are, as you can see here. All right, let me crack on and do some of these tests. And there we are, the MIPS and MFLOPS 133, let's call that, and 53 MFLOPS, so substantially faster than we had with the 50 megahertz clock speed. Okay, I'm going to carry on doing all the tests on this 100 megahertz setup, and then we can put these all together and see what we get. Now, so far I've covered setting up the Z3660 using the config file on the SD card, and I got thinking, and maybe you have too, is that the only way to change the configuration? Because it is a bit of a faff getting the SD card out, putting it onto a PC, programming it, or updating the config file on a PC, and then putting it back in the machine. Quite a lot of physical toing and froing. And the fact is, sHaNsHe has thought of that as well. So along with the drivers and setup files that we've looked at already, sHaNsHe includes an ADF file in the setup media, and I extracted that using WinUAE onto my hard disk file, my HDF file, so I've got access to it now through the Amiga side, and one of the applications in that is something called ZTop that I've moved to my utilities drive, and this is what it looks like. I know sHaNsHe is working on this right now, so that might look slightly different by the time you use it, but basically this is giving me access to the environment variables in the env directory on the SD card. You might remember during the setup process I said delete all of those so that you can use the config file to set all the parameters, but ZTop actually updates the env directory to override what's in the config file. So what you can do, set up the config file to be a sort of known working environment, then use ZTop here through the Amiga to update some of those parameters. So let's just take a quick walk through what we can see on the screen. I must confess, I'm not sure I necessarily know what all of these different options do, but let's work through them. I think the place to start is top right here with the boot mode. So at the moment I'm booting through a real CPU, but the other one I have been looking at is this bottom option of the UAE JIT emulation. SCSI boot enabled, we need that in order to access the hard disk file, so for me that's essential. And this is the auto config RAM, the extra 256 megabytes, just because 128 isn't enough, I tick that. And then I think what you have to do if you want to change this is click on the new entry up here and then click apply boot mode, and that will update the environment variable, so you'll use the different boot modes. Now let's have a look on the right. Well, in my config file, I've set the CPU frequency to be 100 megahertz, but I can override that here with a slider. Like I say, I couldn't get all of these to work properly. Maybe I'll set that to 50 megahertz just so that I start in a nice safe configuration. It's telling me the firmware version here, 1.02, and then some readout statistics, you might say, some temperatures and some voltages, and that from the FPGA itself, so that's the Z-term board readouts. And then it also has a sort of monitor chip on the carrier card itself, which is giving me some temperatures here and voltages. They're looking nice and spot on, actually 3.3 volts and almost 5 volts there, so that's looking good. And then the last one is the O60 reporting its own temperature, 10.6 centigrade, which is clearly wrong, but that goes back to that configuration file setting that I haven't calibrated yet to this particular CPU. So we could, for now, ignore that setting. If I want an update on those figures, I think I just click the refresh, yeah, and it's telling me I'm still running at 100 megahertz, despite what I might have turned the slider here to. JIT enabled, I must confess, I'm not sure what that setting does compared to just setting JIT emulation up here. And then finally, we have this audio low pass filter, which at the moment is set to, well, let's call that 24 kilohertz through the slider here. That will be for AHI and MHI output. But this really useful way of overriding the settings in the config file, so you don't have to physically open up your machine and change, get the SD card out and update it that way. So I'm really pleased to have found this. It's definitely a useful application. Perhaps the final thing to say here is there's a bus test button at the bottom just to do a sort of diagnostic test on your card. I have tried that. It takes an awful long time to run, so I'm not going to show you that running here and now, but that seems to do a deep memory test on each individual memory location just to check that the interface between the Z-turn carrier card, the Z-turn and the carrier card is working properly. With that, I think it's time to move on. So I've collected results using benchmarking applications of all different types, and now's the time to share with you the highlights of those. Beginning with CPU speed. So here are the statistics that I captured in sysinfo at the top and sysspeed at the bottom for the Z3660 operating at 50 megahertz. These are all the familiar figures that we've seen before, and perhaps the one to look at is that second row there where we're showing that at 50 megahertz we're running twice as fast as the A4000 as I pointed out earlier. So that's at 50 megahertz. What happens when we move the clock speed up and double it to 100 megahertz? Well, in simple terms, all the figures double as you would expect. So that's reassuring. But what figures do we get if we operate under emulation instead? Well, that's the third column there. And what's interesting here is if you just look at the top four rows there, which are all the sysinfo tests, broadly speaking, they are saying that the emulation is equivalent to something like 175 megahertz 060. What's interesting here, though, is if you look at the bottom two rows for sysspeed, that's measuring the CPU speed in a different way and actually indicating equivalent to a much faster 060 than 175 megahertz. So this is one of those situations where the devil is in the detail and it depends exactly how you measure speed. But it doesn't really matter which way you cut the cake. The fact is that the emulation is much faster than any real 060 can be. And let's remember, of course, that we can run the emulation without an 060 at all. So I think that is a big bonus factor in the Z3660 and really improves its attraction to us enthusiasts. The one number I want to call out here, though, is the one I've circled there. The sysinfo mFlops under emulation is a lot slower, in fact, at the 060 at 50 megahertz. I don't quite know what's going on there, but that just seems to be an example of weirdness in the emulation rather than anything else, because the equivalent mFlops figure for sysspeed right at the bottom right does actually scale in a sensible way. So that just seems to be weirdness in the emulation, or maybe in the way sysinfo works. I don't know. That's the Z3660 on its own and what it can do. How does it compare with other accelerator cards? Well, I dug out the stats for a Cyberstorm Mark II and the BFG 9060, all running at 50 megahertz, so we've got a consistent clock speed here. And three different benchmarks for CPU speed, and you can see basically all the cards operate in exactly the same way with exactly the same speed to the order of magnitude that you can measure these things in. And so, you know, consistency across the board, and that also extends to measuring at 100 megahertz clock speed. So I think what we take from all of this is the Z3660 behaves exactly like any other accelerator when it comes to just simple integer and floating point arithmetic. It's no slower or faster than any other accelerator, and it all comes down to clock speed of the CPU.
But let's move on now and look at memory speed. And I ran that and tested it in a number of different ways. And what we're looking at here is the results of bus test, which is simply measuring how fast we can move things either into RAM or from RAM. So we've got the read long and write long test here and measured in megabytes per second. So first of all, looking at the first column there, 50 megahertz, we're reading at 26 megabytes per second and writing at 19. When we get to 100 megahertz, that hasn't quite doubled, but it's getting close to it, 48 and 37. And under emulation, significantly faster, as you would expect, because it's all local to that Z-turn card. So those are the figures, but how do they compare against our comparator cards? Let's line those up. And here we do see a difference between the various accelerator cards. The fastest card there in the middle by some distance is the BFG card, and then the Cyberstorm is second fastest, with the Z3660 a little way behind that even. So this is an area where card type does make a difference. Now, proviso, of course, here is that the Z3660 is still under active development and the firmware is changing even as I'm recording this video. So it is possible that those figures for the Z3660 will improve in time. But on these figures, if you are going for the fastest accelerator card for your big box Amiga, then when you put CPU speed and memory speed together, the BFG currently holds that crown. Z3660 is no slouch though, but we do have to take into account memory speed as well as CPU speed. And just for completeness, let's add in now the 100 megahertz figures, and the same story is repeated. At 100 megahertz, the BFG reigns supreme on memory speed. But of course, memory speed isn't everything. We've also got to think about access to information on the hard disk, or in this case, SD card. And there, I think the Z3660 has a real advantage because, as we saw earlier, it has pretty fast access speed for an Amiga, over 10 megabytes a second, and in some cases up to almost 18 megabytes a second. And that really does make a difference in real-world applications. So on all of these three measures, as we put them together, I think the effective speed of the machine is really going to depend on the kinds of applications you're using. If it's down to straight CPU processing of instructions, actually you're not going to notice much difference. If you've got a memory heavy application, then the BFG is probably going to work out faster. But if you're accessing a hard drive on a regular basis, then it could well be the Z3660 is going to be quickest of all. And having said that, of course, that's all if you're using a physical CPU. If you want to work under emulation, well, that is going to trump everything. Now, I've still only just scratched the surface of the Z3660. We haven't looked yet at HDMI capability and retargetable graphics, AHI and MHI support, nor Ethernet networking. And however, we have already got a video that's almost an hour long. So I think what I need to do now is to cut this video here. We'll close this off based on those benchmarks and come back in part 2 to look at the other capabilities of this card, because they really are very impressive. So join me next time to find out more about what this card can actually achieve. But for now, thank you for joining me. Bye.